tells of fallen angels and the bastard children called Nephilim. God destroyed the Nephilim's bodies and doomed them to wander the earth in an invisible dimension, and they are still terrifying men. In our modern paradigm, they are known as demon spirits. The word demon is from the Greek language and means knowledge. The demon knowledge is greater than man's. The Bible tells of their creation in Genesis chapter 6, and they were the cause of the destruction of life on earth. The Apocrypha and early Jewish writings expound on these evil spirits. The book of Enoch tells of their giant stature and how they manipulated the genetics of man and animals, in every imaginable way. In other words, no stone was left unturned in their evil experiments.
These evil spirits who proceeded from the giants that are still roaming the earth, and they will do so until the days of consummation. Here's what they do. They attack, they afflict, they oppress, they destroy, they do battle, they work destruction on the earth, they cause offenses. And again, these spirits proceeded from the giants, who came from people and part spirit. And so their number one target are people. Number one target. Folks, some of this can get weird, but it will explain. You guys have knowledge of the great monoliths and so forth in the world. These great structures, the pyramids and everything else. I'm going to bust a few bubbles tonight, because everybody's starting to go down this wrong path concerning all the constructions of old. And it's not right. Actually, it's quite simple. It's not complicated. It's not a miracle. It's something that was done. And you have to know the architecture of the spiritual realm to understand what I'm talking about. That's like portals. People talk about portals all day. The average person will say, well, what's a portal for? Isn't that from the Wizard of Oz or something? Right? But let me explain something to you. These evil spirits don't need a portal. They've been here since the beginning. I'll share something with you. Just to show you what people may not know, but it's knowledge and wisdom that was given out a long time ago that people don't really accept now. Now understand this. God gives His wisdom to anyone who will receive it. The problem is no one wants to receive His wisdom because they already think they have enough. Okay? They already think they have enough. I've heard a great many stories about the children of heaven who are called the Watchers, the first set. God referred to them as the children of heaven. How many knew that? They were the children. They were young. One of the same angels that made a pact on Mount Hermon was also the serpent in the garden. How many know that? How many know that? He was in the Garden of Eden. He is a serpent that did his thing. Semyaza was deceived by Lucifer himself, which, by the way, his kind is of a serpent. Just so you don't think I'm going off the rocker, you're also going to have to know about Michael, Uriel, Raphael, Gabriel, Ramiel, Sarakihal, and Raguel. You have to know about those angels. You're going to have to know who the four angels are that stand before God and what their jobs are. By the way, it's your heritage. You need to know what their jobs are, right? It's your heritage. You do realize they're fellow servants. The angels are. They're your fellow servants. How many know that the angels are your fellow servants? The only thing missing is the true archetypes of who they are. Because mankind once deified them. They once deified them, not understanding their jobs. And then when Jesus Christ came, He placed some of their responsibilities in you through the Holy Spirit. How many know that? How many know that? You know what? You might be really thankful for Jesus Christ after this conversation. Salvation is one thing, but to be able to survive and walk and stand in this world, that's another thing.
Giants walk among us still, hidden in tattered robes. They speak quiet mostly, though their presence always known. They fall like thunder, wither and die, struggle incessantly, reaching the sky. We try to box them, they cannot fit in. The giants corrupt what we try to keep hidden. And if one day we make it inside, find a way to conquer the giant's hide, we'll watch the giants that we slew, and find that we killed ourselves too.
A good distance, 1,000, 2,000 years after the flood, he's writing this. And he says the Nephilim, the unholy progeny of the fallen angels and the women of earth, creating this hybrid being known as the Nephilim, were on the earth in those days and also afterward. In other words, and there's a lot of confusion about this. There's only one incursion. Nonsense. There are many incursions, multiple incursions.
And in fact, when Joshua came into the Promised Land,
Who's there?
he had to fight, let's face it, non-human beings. They're called giants in the Bible. In Hebrew, they have many names. But my point, and here's the point, folks, that I want to make as we begin to talk about Watchers 8, because it opens on a note that you might find unbelievable. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. But I have to say that before the flood, the supernatural descended and touched the natural world. Jude talks about this.
Sure.
Peter talks about it. Good old Apostle Peter mentions this, the fact that the angels left their first estate. There are a lot of people who argue against this, saying, these were the sons of Seth and so forth. But for the sake of our today's program, what L.A. and I would like to stress is the fact that we are now entering those days once again.
North American accounts of the giant skeletons that were found in the Ohio and Pennsylvania Valley. I'm talking everything from 10 to 12 foot tall guys found in copper armor. And the more I investigated, I found out it was a worldwide situation where we're talking some really big skeletons, all the way up to 36 feet tall.
If we only had basketball then, huh?
Well, I can tell you this, when some of these guys, some of the British giants, for instance, one guy specifically, listen to this, a guy by the name of William Joyce in the late 1800s, he could lift a ton dead weight, in other words, 2,000 pounds. And that you're only talking about a guy that was 8 feet tall. So I think the situation that most people find in history is there are too many question marks. And when you're looking at the temples of the world, and you're looking at all of the, what would you say, the answers that are out there, but seemingly are, swept under the rug, I think it becomes apparent that for some reason, someone doesn't want the issue of giants brought up, and that's why I spent 3 decades dealing with it. And as you know, the book has got on the front cover a British explorer with 2 12-foot giants from Kashmir standing over him. Now, again, this was in the late 1890s, and as early as 1970, in the jungles of the Amazon, there have been actual reports of people running into very shy natives who are in excess of 9 feet tall.
How tall do you think the little guy is in the middle on your cover of your book, Genesis 6?
According to they claim he's right at 6 feet. When I got that from a group of people in London that have the only photos of these guys around. Also in the book, I have a picture of a 12'2" Irish mummy, and it's fascinating because later in the show we can get into the mummy issue. But the point that's fascinating is if you take guys that are all the way up to 36 feet tall, 20 feet tall. The Emperor of China had 2 15-foot guards. Charlemagne himself was surrounded by rather large individuals. We have a Roman emperor named Maximinius who was a giant himself. His wife's bracelet, George, would fit around his thumb. We're talking about people that are, we're talking about people with big egos, big appetites, and incredible strength. We're not talking about the medical situation that you see sometimes on the History Channel where they show giants as being these guys that don't live very long, obviously like Andre the Giant, who was a wrestler. Right. We're talking about guys with unbelievable strength, unbelievable knowledge, and unbelievable wisdom. On the website, I even show some of the Incan kings, I-N-C-A-N, Inca, from the Inca Empire, basically in the museums of Peru, that have 4 to 5 times the cranial mass of a standard human skull. So we're not only talking about big guys, we're talking about people with incredible intelligence, and we're talking about an answer that obviously classical anthropology and archaeology, these guys don't want to deal with this. I think it was David Hatcher Childress that coined the word Smithsonian Gate. In other words, a cover-up of history that's rather pronounced. And when you begin to dig, as I began digging over 30 years ago, you can find out that the reports of newspapers in America, of newspapers around the world. Interestingly enough, after I did the last show with Art, somebody went on the website and they sent me from Eastern Europe, they've already sponsored I guess you'd say an undertaking to go into some of the caves where they found a whole, basically, cavern of giant skeletons. And in the New Ancient American, which is a magazine that's put out in America, they found the most contemporary find. It's someplace in desert Southwest, and it actually shows the pictures of the giants, shows the cave, etc. So basically, interestingly enough, too, is that when you look at this, you see that there is a very, very, how should I say, skittish archaeological base out there that doesn't even want to deal with this.
Well, do you think, Stephen, that these giants were regular offsprings of people, or that they popped up in a very unusual way, depending on the percent of population at the time?
Well, first of all, I believe that the reason I use Genesis 6, let me read this and then I'll comment.
All right.
Genesis 6, 1, 2, and 6 are kind of interesting because it gets into the whole alien, the whole Nephilim, the whole Zechariah, Sitchin, Anunnaki. But let me read it. It says this: "And it came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives, all of which they chose. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bore children unto them, the same became the mighty men which are of old, men of renown." Now, there are two opposing viewpoints on this. During about the 4th century A.D., the Catholic Church basically said, well, no, these were the sons of Seth. And the sons of Seth married the daughters of Cain, and out of good men marrying bad women came giants. We're talking about men, George, that had 6 fingers, 6 toes, and double sets of teeth. Now, that's kind of interesting because all through the digs in North America, especially in Catalina in California, Lompoc, where there's a prison in California, they found red-haired giants, 10 to 12 feet tall, double sets of teeth, 6 fingers, 6 toes. You go to South America, and the Mayan god Shambhalum had 6 fingers, 6 toes. And so I believe there is a supernatural element, and then you've got writers who claim that we were created by the aliens, the Anunnaki, and obviously I don't believe that. I believe that all the myths of history center around this one thing, that basically supernatural beings had sex with earth women and produced giants. And it's in the Bible, it's in Genesis 6, Jude 6, 2 Peter, but more than that, and in addition to that, it's all through history.
So you believe that these giants are the offspring of
fallen angels.
Fallen angels from way gone back.
Well, from way gone back. Cyclops, giants with one eye in the center of the forehead. And by the way, 2 months ago in Indonesia, there were actual cyclopean skulls found, one eye, giant, and immediately the standard, if you will, anthropological community came out and said, oh, these are just basically calcified remains of a normal skull. And, you know, it's interesting because, again, you know, basically you have from just the Genesis account of these fallen angels having sex with earth women, producing, again, a race of incredible people. You know, everybody's heard of David and Goliath,
yes.
But what they don't know is that Goliath had, you know, 4 brothers, and these guys all had 6 fingers, 6 toes. There's a guy named Og, O-G, not a hard name to remember, and some scholars place him at 18 feet tall. So from the Genesis account in the Old Testament through all of the the historical accounts through the different continents, whether you're dealing with South America, whether you're dealing with North America, the Europeans, the Asians, the Australians, the Greeks, everybody has got their records, their bones. And, you know, interestingly enough, in classic anthropology, classic archaeology, this stuff is basically taboo. They won't deal with it.
That extinct species of giant, whose bones fill the mounds of America, have gazed on Niagara as ours do now. And that quote is amazing for a number of reasons. First of all, that Abraham Lincoln said it. Number 2, that it shows how widespread the knowledge of the giants in the 19th century were. We were an agrarian society. People were plowing fields all over America and turning up giant bones everywhere. The other interesting point is that an ancient town of giants was found on the Canadian-U.S. border near Niagara Falls with several hundred giants, houses with chimneys. They even found a blacksmith shop with 2 tons of charcoal and evidence of gold and silver work. And then close to there in Cayuga, New York, they found what was called the Cemetery of Giants. That was 200 skeletons, 7 to 9 feet tall. A little farther down the state on the Pennsylvania line, they found 150 skeletons, 7 feet tall. And this continues all the way down the coast of America and all the way across the middle of America and out to Catalina Island in California, which is one of the most astonishing stories you'll ever hear. The Smithsonian, when they started out, they published their first book in 1848 on the ancient monuments of the Mississippi Valley. It was an incredibly open-minded study with beautiful drawings of all of the mound builder finds that they had made in the middle of the country. Now, we're not talking about American Indians here. We're talking about what they refer to as the mound builder culture. And that predates the Indians, and it reached its height probably around 1200 AD. But we're now getting dates all the way back to 10,000 BC. And this mound builder culture is pervasive. The Smithsonian report itself said there was several 100,000 mounds in the United States. Now, in 1879, Major John Wesley Powell, who was a famous Western explorer, made the first head of the Bureau of Ethnology. In 1879, he issued what was called the Powell Doctrine. And the Powell Doctrine forbade any evidence of pre-Columbus contact in the Americas. He said we're dealing with Aboriginal savages who are illiterate. There's no signs of higher intelligence. Basically, it was carte blanche for manifest destiny, and also one of the cornerstones of the Smithsonian was the theory of evolution. And the theory of evolution, in a nutshell, says that we keep getting bigger and smarter over time. And you can't very well have 7 to 12 foot giants everywhere in America and argue that we're getting bigger and smarter. So,
nope.
That pretty much, and they've never rescinded the Powell Doctrine. So, in case after case after case, these skeletons are being sent to the Smithsonian and just disappearing. In the book 1491, he estimates that Ailes Hedricka, who was the head of the Smithsonian from the turn of the century, and the man that came up with the absurd Bering Land Strait, they all came, down from Asia.
Yeah.
They estimate in that book that he had secreted over 30,000 skeletons during his tenure and refused to examine them.
What happened with them then? Do we know?
Well, I think it's kind of like that Raiders of the Lost Ark movie. They put them in boxes and they go off somewhere into the memory hole. There's, a couple of cases where somebody's actually, the Fowler Museum in UCLA purports to have 200 of the skeletons found out in Catalina, but that's a whole other story we can get into. The Smithsonian, on the other hand, is completely not forthcoming at all.
Now, who would you say, if we could try to tackle that question a little bit, of who actually discovered America, or has it always been inhabited, do you think?
Well, it's very curious. Some of the finds, including the Spirit Cave mummies, which were found out in Nevada, they were discovered in the 1940s by the University of Nevada under several feet of bat guano. And they were incredibly well preserved, red hair, still intact, and covered in an incredibly finely woven fabric made out of tule reed, which is like papyrus. These things were dated at the time to be 1,000 years old and promptly filed away. And several years ago, a University of California researcher heard about them. He got one of them, carbon dated it to 7,500 BC.
Huh.
We're talking about advanced weaving and mummification in the Americas at 7,500 BC. So at one point, I say, well, maybe we discovered them and they didn't discover us.
Exactly, yeah.
But the related finds, especially in the Newark earthworks and up in Iowa along the Mississippi River, there's evidence of hieroglyphs, Egyptian writing, Roman coins. There's Hebrew holy stones that they found. The list just goes on and on. Viking, Celtic, Scythian, Asian, Hindu. I think everyone knew we were here, except kids that go to school in America these days. And in Newark, Ohio, where a number of giants have been found, Ohio University has in their collection what they call the Holy Stone, which is a condensed version of the Ten Commandments, and some ritual cleansing bowls, which have been dated to the Second Temple. So it does raise some interesting religious questions as well.
I mean, when we think about this, then, if we consider cultural diffusion as opposed to walking over the Bering's land bridge there, we have a potential situation where different peoples for thousands of years have traveled over to America. I mean, there is this with the copper mines, which seems to have pretty established that there might have been trade routes going back to,
Absolutely.
I don't know, 2,000 years, right?
Well, the copper mines in Keweenaw Peninsula in northern Michigan are some of the most interesting, fascinating things I ran across in the book. Right north of the tip of the peninsula is something called Isle Royale, which is an island that's virtually made out of copper. And it's the highest quality, purest copper in the world because of the volcanic upthrust. The copper was all exposed to the air and the sulfur impurities burned off. Now, they've got evidence of mining there that go back 10,000 years. And there was two professors from Michigan that published a book that estimated 1.5 billion tons of copper were taken out of there. The kings and queens, the giants in the mounds that I go through in the book are almost always covered in copper jewelry, copper crowns, copper armor, micas, often in association with that. But that in no way accounts for the extraordinary amount of copper that was taken out of there. And there's indications, there's some rock art I saw that looked like a boat from Crete had been engraved. And there's stories of monolithic docks up there, quays, dams, all kinds of things. So there's, and also I even ran across, they won't test the European copper for the Michigan signature, but purity is over 99%.
Right.
So it's so unique. And also their copper working techniques were superior to anything we have. They used annealing, which was hot and cold water and cold hammering. And report after report says these axes are as strong as steel. We don't understand how they were made.
So, who do you think was responsible for the mines, for the mining?
Well, again, there's huge finds of giants up there. I mean, basically what we're talking about is not that America was populated exclusively with giants, but that the ruling class was composed of giants. And mound after mound after mound, the central burial is of a giant. Sometimes he's surrounded in a sun circle burial with 10 warriors with their feet pointing at him. I have a great series of reports out of Tennessee and Kentucky that was done by Dr. John Haywood in 1823, where he went over 100 years of the stuff they had been finding there, and they found 9-foot blonde-haired giants in secret caves with roll-away stones, sacred springs, standing burials with monoliths around them. Just extraordinary stuff.
Golden Gate Bridge. It's built out of steel, and it expands. And you've got to have expansion joints. So when you're driving on the deck of the bridge, you'll cross over a grate, and that grate is interlocking like the fingers on your hands. And as the sun shines on the steel, it expands and contracts an inch or 2 or 3 or 5. I don't know how much it expands, but it's got an expansion joint in there. Well, the Great Pyramid, when the sun shines on one side of it, it will expand faster, expand more than on the side where the sun isn't shining. So you've got to have them. Golden Gate Bridge, or the Bay Bridge. And of course the Twin Towers, they didn't last very long. Now, it would say to me, people who built the Great Pyramid must have had at least the same technology that we had in 1964 to measure it. You know, just my common sense says to me, if we couldn't measure the damn thing until 1964, because we didn't have a laser transit, then the people that built it had to have at least had the technology of a laser transit to build it. Because up until 1964, boys and girls, we couldn't duplicate it without the laser transit. So whether the guys who built the thing, and I was told this one time, I said, well, how did they level it up? Now the thing sits plumb. It's level. But then when this thing sits on 14 acres and it's plus or minus plumb, and then it's plus or minus a half inch on 4 corners, sitting on 14 acres, which is bigger than the Empire State Building, which is bigger than the Twin Towers, which is more accurate than either. You know, you got to sit there and say, hey, wait a minute. These guys were not savages dragging their knuckles on the back of the ground. These were not Cro-Magnons. we can't duplicate the thing today. That tells me they got to be smarter than we are. Now, if we could duplicate the thing today, we'd have 4 or 5 of them sitting out there. And you don't see anybody building those today. Now, there had to be a reason for it. I don't know what the reason was. And that's another thing. People don't spend $32, $64, or $128 billion, building the most massive building that's ever been constructed in the history of mankind without a purpose. We haven't got a clue. Can't figure it out. Nobody's spending $128 billion today to build something over there in Washington, D.C. to commemorate World War II. We don't have the money, number one. Number two, if we had the money, we couldn't duplicate it. Don't know how. We don't know how they did it. Well, the guy that wrote the book Dead Men's Secrets, his name is Jonathan Gray. He hits upon this very subject matter over here. In fact, he hits upon a number of areas of life, like geography, astronomy, cosmology, mathematics, metallurgy, large-scale construction techniques, social organization, engineering, mechanical devices, everyday items, clothing, art, medicine, flight, space travel, ancient science, and civilization. Can you imagine space travel before Christ? Ancient science before Christ, civilization before Christ, flight, medicine, art, and clothing before Christ, equal to or superior to anything that we have today. Now, right away, somebody says, well, if that were true, we would have heard about it from archaeology. You would? You would? Excuse me. In 1940, there was a skeleton up here in the museum in Chicago. I think they call it the Museum of Natural History. It was a 14-foot skeleton. Now, the Bible says there were giants on earth in those days. This is back in Genesis chapter 5, I believe it is, or 6. There were giants on earth in those days. That does not fit with the theory of evolution. It doesn't fit with modern science. Now, go into that museum today, and you're not going to find that 14-foot skeleton that was there in 1940. I don't know what happened to it. I'm just telling you that in 1940 it was there. Today it's gone. It doesn't fit with the theory of evolution, and I first of all want to tell you that that is not science and that is not academic. That is propaganda. If it doesn't fit with your theory, what you do is you destroy it. You eliminate it. Get rid of it. And that's not honest. And then it's not intellectual. So when I hear stories like that, I say to myself, well, why would archaeology, why would science, why would people in museums want to deliberately destroy the evidence? I mean, if there were giants, then why don't we say, well, gosh, there were giants? That's the truth. How many of these giants were there? Well, now, it could be that the 14-foot giant was just an anomaly. You know, it happens once in a while. You look in the Guinness Book of Records, there was a guy that was just, I think it was 8'11", or 8'10.5" or something, just a shade under 9 feet tall. And the Bible talks about a guy named Goliath. You know, there's David and Goliath. There's a Bible story there. Well, Goliath was 9'6". And compared to the giants described in the Bible, Goliath was a midget. You know, 9 feet is pretty tall when you're comparing it to a 6-foot man, but 14 feet. And there was the story of a guy named King Og, and his bedstead was 14 feet. So the 14-foot skeleton that was in the Chicago Museum was an average run-of-the-mill 14-foot skeleton. There were people that were 15, 16 feet tall. And I suppose there were people that were 9, 10, 11, 12 feet tall, but they're all big. They're big guys. Now, are there any other skeletons beside that one in the Museum of Natural History in Chicago? And the answer is yes, by the hundreds. They've been discovered all over the world. And Dead Men's Secrets identifies the locations of those finds. Now, I didn't know that before. So I had heard of the Great Pyramid. I had heard of the Nazca monuments out here in the desert where they get spiders and monkeys, you know, that are miles across, 6-8 miles across. And big buildings with building blocks that weigh 50 tons down in Peru and Ecuador. And cities that are built on cliffs and on top of mountains, you know. Those are just one here and one there and one. It makes you think, well, my God, were there people out here in ancient times smarter than we are today, more technologically advanced? Did they have ships that could go across the oceans? Before the flood, flying in jet airplanes, they had medicine equal to today, art, clothing, and mechanical devices that have been dug up, but they don't fit the theory of evolution. See, evolution is a fairy tale for adults that tells us once upon a time, long, long ago and far, far away, And then they proceed to tell us the story about how billions and billions of years ago thus and such occurred. Pure fantasy. There isn't a shred of evidence, not a shred of proof. No scientific tests can be duplicated. And, if people want to believe that, that's fine. There's no problem with that. People believe in religion. I kind of watch people, religious people. They scare the hell out of me, and I watch them as far away as I can get from them. And then they believe in superstition. And rational people who attach themselves to science, they attach themselves to another superstition called evolution. I call that science. I look at both of them and I say, oh my God, I got one superstitious bunch on the one hand, and I look over here and I got another superstitious bunch on the other hand. And neither side can ever come to an actual grasp of truth and understanding, how did it actually happen? So in order for us to do that, if we're going to arrive at the truth, we got to actually come to grips with 14-foot skeletons and buildings that are so big and so massive that we can't duplicate them today, and ask the question, well, how did those people build that? Who was here to do that? We look at Stonehenge, in amazement to this day, and say, how in the world did those people get 30-ton blocks of rock sitting up there on top of that? That would be a whale of a feat. It can be duplicated. We could do Stonehenge. But hey, boys and girls, there's a lot of buildings around the world that we can't duplicate today. There's a block of rock in a wall down in Ecuador that weighs 200,000 tons. It's a dressed rock. It's a square. I say square, it's rectangular, but it's got corners to it. It's got 8 corners. And these corners, are exact. It didn't just evolve this way. If you're out here walking around, and you see a block of rock over here and this thing is square, and you measure it up and it's got the same measurements all around it, you can be pretty sure that some intelligence over here squared that thing up. Here's the crazy part of it. Do you know how much 200,000 tons is? That's a lot of weight. That's a big chunk. Let me describe. The Titanic, that big ship, the Titanic, and the Queen Mary, these big merchant ships. Well, those big luxury liners weigh about 40,000 tons. 40,000 tons. All right, now let's pull the Queen Mary into a shipyard, and let's just stick it under a couple of cranes, and let's just pick it up and set it on the ground. Do you think that there's any place in the world that there's a crane big enough to pick up a ship like the Queen Mary? Well, I'm here to tell you that there isn't. So when they want to work on a ship that big, what they have to do is run it into what they call a dry dock. That's a big hole in the ground that they can flood with water. They can float the thing in, and then they let the water out of it, and the thing settles down on the bottom, and then they can go in there and then go to work on it. So when we want to work on a ship, we have to put it in a dry dock. You can't pick it up. Now, there are places that have cranes that pick up fishing boats and just pick them up out of the water and stick them over here on the ground, and then they work on them, and then they pick them up off the ground, and they set them back in the water. Fishing boats and things like that. Now, let's go down here. I told you there's a rock here that's now 200,000 tons. There's lots of rocks that are 50,000 tons. That's as big as or bigger than the Queen Mary. There's lots of rocks that weigh 200 tons. They go anywhere from 3, 6, 16, 30, 50 tons, things like that. And these rocks are set into walls, and they're dressed. Now, some of them are square. Some of them are odd shapes, and then the odd shape fits with the next rock, and it's cut in an odd shape to fit, kind of like looking at a puzzle. The odd shapes that go into a jigsaw puzzle. And remember that the tab has to fit into a corresponding hole. And then when you're doing a jigsaw puzzle, if you'll think about it, yeah, it's true, you got a tab and you got a hole, but they don't fit together perfectly. So if they don't fit together perfectly, well, then obviously it doesn't go there. All right, well, these rocks are built like a jigsaw puzzle. They're so close together you can't stick a knife blade between them. So they were cut. There isn't any technology today that can cut rock irregularly and then put them together. None. Doesn't exist. And yet there they are. Now, those people that did that were smarter than we are today. They had a greater technology than we have today. And the Bible talks about that. And the Bible talks about space flight. The Bible talks about flight. And yet your preacher doesn't talk about that because if he did, he wouldn't last long as your preacher. Because he subscribes to evolutionary philosophy, and he doesn't tell you everything that's in the Bible. And unless you read it for yourself, you wouldn't know that. And most religious people don't read the Bible. They haven't got a clue. So atheists and agnostics and evolutionists, they don't read the Bible because they don't want to. The religious guys, they don't read the Bible because I'm not sure that they're capable. mean, everybody's got one, but they don't read it. And if they read it, they don't believe what it says. I mean, time and time and time again, you take a look at people's actions, in life. People don't practice Exodus chapter 12. Jesus asked the question, he said, well, why do you people call me Lord, Lord, and do not the things which I say? That's because they've got a different God, they've got a different religion, they got a different program over here that they follow. They don't follow the Scripture. Well, anyway, Jonathan Gray over here writes a book called Dead Men's Secrets. And I want to tell you a little story here, pertinently. William Prescott, the great archaeologist, reminds us that a nation may pass away and leave only the memory of its existence, but the stories of science that it has gathered up will endure forever. You see, folklore is a fossil of history. It preserves history in the guise of colorful tales. Far from being a collection of fables, it is a recital of actual past events, even though from generation to generation some facts have become distorted or forgotten. Professor I.A. Efremov of the Soviet Union cautions that historians must pay more respect to ancient traditions and folklore, and he accuses Western science of snobbishness in rejecting the tales of the common people. We must face it, legends are usually based on hardcore fact. Take the legend of Troy, for instance. No scholar ever took the Iliad or the Odyssey of Homer as history. But Schliemann, putting faith in it, discovered the mythical city of Troy. The Iliad spoke of a cup decorated with doves, which Odysseus used. In a shaft, Schliemann found the 3,600-year-old cup. Herodias told a fabulous story of a distant country where griffins guarded a golden treasure. This land, Altai or Kim-Shan, has now been found, together with ancient gold mines and decorations from a high culture, prominently display the griffin. This vague myth is now seen to be a fact. Mexican Indian legends spoke of a sacred well of sacrifice into which maidens and jewelry were hurled. Historians dismiss this as a mere tale, until the well at Chichen Itza was discovered in the 19th century. Now, more than any document, the Bible has been assailed as a collection of fanciful myths. And yet, to the embarrassment of its critics, archaeological discoveries have proved time and time again that the fabled cities, mythical persons, and impossible events were not only true, but they were in fact reliable historical reporting in every detail. And indeed, the Bible can now be regarded as the most accurate and the most trustworthy source of history that we possess. All right, so these legends are usually based upon hardcore fact. Now, our ancestral memory of the Golden Era. If we were to credit the collective testimony of all ancient races, man's early history was truly an incredible history. It was a golden age of advanced civilization, of original giants who had superior intelligence and technology. This appears to have been a universal truth known to everyone in ancient times. Sacred records affirm that at the very beginning, soon after the fall from paradise, men possessed extraordinary mental abilities. Beginning with the raw earth, they mastered a high level of civilization and technology in just the first 6 generations of their existence. In that short time, they were able to build cities, play complex musical instruments, and smelt metals. Indeed, with their scientific complexities, these earliest men, it seems, were no fools. We might well wonder to what degree they further developed and refined this technology. In the final few centuries before the flood struck, were the miracles of science as common as they are now? A perfectly valid question, I would think. Now imagine, if you can, paved rainbow cities whose houses of crystal reflected every special hue, and we're talking about air travel, computers, and plastics. Now, did you know that when Alexander Graham Bell gave us the telephone, he said that it had been done before? The old devices have been reinvented, he observed. Yes, you read it right. That's exactly what Bell said. He said, in fact, the question was pressed further by the eminent British scientist Frederick Soddy. He's a winner of the Nobel Prize in Physics, and he wondered whether the ancients might not only have attained our present knowledge, but a power hitherto unmastered by us at this time. Now, there are physical remains also. So, in our quest here for the truth concerning ancient civilizations, we've got to have some physical evidence. as a jurist or a lawyer, if we went into court and we wanted to prove our theory or prove our side of the case, we'd have to have some kind of evidence. We call them exhibits, physical evidence. Now, where did Bell and Soddy get their information? Well, quite possibly from some rusty old records. Nevertheless, our quest is not based on ancient texts and reports, but on accepted scientific discoveries. There are recently discovered artifacts that cannot be dismissed, namely objects of metal sitting in museums today that are unquestionably made in the ancient world that would have required very advanced technology to produce, a technology not to be repeated until our day today. The weight of evidence grows daily, evidence that all of the major secrets of modern technology were known and then forgotten long ago. Evidence that early man did create a society that surpassed ours in all aspects of development. The entire world is really a dead man's tomb. It's a treasure hunter's paradise. As we prize or we open the coffin, suspense builds. And slowly, we are lifting the lid on a lost technology which almost smacks of science fiction. We come face to face with such absurdities as brain transplants, colonies on Mars, and invisible men. And then we wonder, what's next? Well, admittedly, such concepts almost strain credibility. And we're tempted to ask, could the ancients have really advanced so far? It may help to consider our own age. As recently as 100 years ago, were not most of today's inventions totally unknown, even unbelievable? Since then, the spawning has been very sudden and very rapid. And what's more, the present age of basic discoveries is hardly at its end. It is forecast that just 15 years in the future, the accumulated knowledge that we have today will double in just 15 years. Now, can you grasp what that means? How then can one possibly conceive of the state of knowledge attained by the Antediluvians before the deluge struck? Let me ask you this question. Think about this for a second. In the Bible, it tells us that they were artificers in brass and iron in Genesis chapter 4. An artificer in brass and iron. Let's go back to Columbus. No, we look back 500 years and we say, well, that's the Middle Ages, and technology wasn't as advanced as it is today, but we had ships. And we had metallurgy, we had swords, and they had some cannons, they had guns, they knew about gunpowder. Well, in Columbus's day, in 1500, they were still casting cannon in sand. A turret lathe had not been invented yet. Metalworking tools, such as lathes, were yet to be discovered in the future. Now, if we were casting cannon in sand 500 years ago, and within 500 years we're putting men on the moon, if in Genesis 4 they already had advanced metallurgy, that is, the mixing of metals together, which is advanced beyond casting cannon in sand, couldn't they do the same thing in 500 years? Now, the amount of time from Adam and Eve until the flood was 1,656 years. So if in the first 1,100 years, they were able to reach metallurgy, then they had 556 years left with which to duplicate the technology that we have today. Now, there's an obscure scripture here in the Bible. I thought I'd point this one out. It's in Deuteronomy chapter 30. That anticipates space travel. I looked at this some years back, and I kind of marveled, and I said, why would God even put such a thing in there unless he was already familiar with? In verse 4 it says, if any of yours be driven out unto the outmost parts of heaven, from thence will the Lord your God gather you, and from thence shall he fetch you. How far out into the heavens has man traveled that he has been lost on other planets or on other moons, like, say, our moon or Mars? I don't know. It never entered our vocabulary until the last 50 years. It's been in my lifetime. When I was a kid, we used to read the comics, and there was a guy by the name of Flash Gordon. That was science fiction. That was in the 1950s. Nobody ever thought that anybody was going to travel to the moon or build a space station or put satellites up in the air with which we could bounce radio waves off of and telephone calls. Never occurred to anybody. We had Dick Tracy with a watch, a two-way communication watch. Today we all have cell phones. Dick Tracy, science fiction, 1950. He's got a two-way wrist radio. Today everybody's got a cell phone talking with people anywhere in the world. Now we did that in the last 50 years or so. And notice that the technology that we have here today, in the world today, just take a look around you, computers, automobiles, airplanes, jet airplanes. We didn't have that 100 years ago. Go back 200 years. Look what has been accomplished over the past 200 years and ask yourself, if these people were already advanced in metallurgy prior to, this is BC, this is way before the flood, for crying out loud, this is before Noah's Ark. Now I know, you go to the movies and you look at the movie, Noah's Ark, or you look at the movies that are produced by Cecil B. DeMille, in Egyptian times, and we say, hey, these people are barbarians. They're ancient. They don't have technology. They're building pyramids that we can't duplicate today. They're building buildings and monuments that we don't have a technology to do. But they're dragging their knuckles on the ground and hitting their women over the head and dragging them off. That's preposterous poppycock. It's insane. Doesn't add up with the physical evidence. I mean, that pyramid is sitting there, boys and girls, like it or lump it. It's there. We can't build one today. We don't have the money. There isn't anybody in the world, including the United States of America, has got the money to duplicate that Great Pyramid. Technologically, we could do it today, but it wasn't until 1964 that we were able to do it. Now, those people back in those days, they built that thing. And here's the Bible talking about space travel here in Deuteronomy 30, verse 4. And I'm sitting there saying, if we can come to space travel, if we can come to jet engine flight in 100 years, from 1900 to 2000, this isn't too much of a stretch of my imagination to see somebody doing this prior to the flood. And do we have any physical evidence of it? Oh, you betcha we do. Physical evidence abounds. Not 1 or 2 or 5 or 10, but by the hundreds. By the hundreds. For instance, he's got some sections in here. I'm going to flip over here to, I guess, number 16. Let me get to chapter 16 here. And the one that as a contractor, the one that I was really surprised to see, there are 64 examples of construction techniques that have not been duplicated until the 20th century. That's not the buildings themselves. That's the techniques, like concrete. We think of cement today, building the Empire State Building with steel and concrete, as being something new and modern that we just came up with in the last 100 years. You go back here 200 years, you didn't see any Empire State Buildings. Now, that's a modern technology. There's some buildings that have been built out here in the hinterlands, and there's microscopes. Did you know that in Moses' time they had microscopes? I was absolutely amazed. Glasswork and microscopes. I'm going to give you some examples. 24 examples of glasswork and microscopes sit in the museums today, not on display. They sit down in the basements, hidden away so that you can't see them. Like the skeleton of the 14-foot giant up in Chicago. They're not on display. They exist. They were found. They've been recorded. We have the pictures of it. We know that they're there. But they don't fit the theory of evolution. And anything that doesn't fit with evolution is not put on display. Nobody has an explanation for it. Well, there's an explanation. When you see something like a 200,000-ton block of rock that is set in position, somebody had the technology to make it, pick it up, move it, and set it into place. We can't do that today. And since we can't explain that, and our fairy tale dream world says that we're evolving better and better, smarter and smarter, it doesn't fit with the evolution fairy tale. So then we ignore it. We hide it. We pretend it doesn't exist. As I said, that's not science, and it's not academic. It's just propaganda. So over here in chapter 16, we've got some buildings. I want to point out a couple of 3 buildings here. We've got about 10 minutes. So. A startling surprise awaited Captain Don Henry on that particular day in 1976. He was 40 miles off the southern coast of Florida directing sonar readings on the ocean floor. Suddenly, an immense pyramid-shaped structure showed up. It was 300 feet below the surface. Subsequent underwater closed-circuit TV was to show the pyramid to be about 420 feet high. It's a veritable skyscraper, nearly the size of the Great Pyramids of Egypt. When 12 other pyramids turned up on a NASA satellite photograph of the Amazon jungle. Noted author Charles Berlitz and Dr. Manson Valentine, curator of the Miami Science Museum, excitedly organized a major scientific expedition to the underwater pyramid, the first of its kind, which set out with a crack team of 15 archaeologists, researchers, and divers early in August of 1978. At the same time, a NASA-supported expedition led by Florida explorer Philip Miller set out for the Amazon jungles of Peru, accompanied by a documentary film team to investigate the foliage-covered pyramids found there. I'm intrigued by an apparent relationship here. Huge ruins throughout the world generally resemble each other in construction, as well as in geographical and astronomical alignment. What is more, constructions which are technologically impossible today face us. Precise construction and colossal size indicate that the builders had unknown techniques and energy sources at their disposal. It makes one feel that these magnificent, time-defying ruins that still exist after 4,000 years can hardly be the work of primitive barbarians. Surely they are the scientific instruments of an advanced universal civilization. So join me on a grand tour, and you'll see what I mean. This is not possible by muscular strength. This grand complex was built with a technical skill embarrassing to us and by a method which is totally unknown to us today. Here was a city of startling dimensions. Acres and acres lie covered with truncated pyramids, artificial hills, lines of monoliths, platforms, underground rooms, and giant gates which incorporate architecture beyond our technical scope today. Many large gateways were built from a single stone. The Gate of the Sun is the biggest carved monolith in the world. It is a single block of rock, 10 feet high and 6 feet wide. The size of some of the buildings is astonishing. The fortress of Akapana, 650 by 496 feet, was once a pyramid 167 feet high. The Sun Temple was on a platform 440 feet long by 390 feet wide, composed of blocks of rock 100 to 200 tons each. Walls of the temple complex itself had blocks of 60 tons each. Steps of the stone stairway were 50 tons apiece. Here were terraced temples, like those of faraway Babylon and Nineveh. The walls of the palace were 220 feet long by 180 feet wide. Its throne room was 160 feet long by 130 feet wide. The steps from the palace entrance were washed by the lake now receding and 15 miles away. The paved court under our feet is 80 feet square, with a covered gallery 45 feet on one side. Court and hall are one single block of dressed stone. One single block. Building blocks. One is 36 feet long, 7 feet wide, fitted without lime or mortar and without any joint showing. Nearly every stone is accurately cut and polished, nicked, mortised, and occasionally even beveled. Water conduits have a completely modem shape with smooth cross-sections, polished inner and outer surfaces, and accurate edges. See these half pipes? They have grooves and corresponding protrusions that fit together. Plundered Spanish invaders stole the interlocking copper or silver keys which secured the stonework from earthquake damage until they had survived for thousands of years. Subsequent earthquakes leveled the structures. As late as the 19th century, there were imposing colonnades to admire, of which sadly there is now no trace. Many of the great buildings were dynamited, and then untold treasures disappeared. One 24-foot statue remains. But the records are there. You see, when the Spanish got there, they made records of it. And then they tore them down, blew them up to salvage the gold, silver, and the metals, shipped them off to Spain. Here's the point. Here are buildings at 12,000 feet in Bolivia that we could not build today, let alone at 12,000 feet. And we're being told, in our movies and in our books, that these great monuments were built by slave labor, and they were built by hand, without wheels, without pulleys, just by pure muscle. That's preposterous poppycock. You talk about fantasy world. Hey, you talk about fairy tales. That's a fairy tale. But it's better than that. All right, we are reviewing the book called Dead Men's Secrets. So last time I gave you an introduction, and I said, hey, listen, there's some big monuments around the world. In fact, in this chapter 16, there are 57 of these examples of architectural marvels and wonders that are built around the world that we can't build today. You know, it's one thing to say, well, yeah, we could duplicate that today. But when you've got monuments out here, as I pointed out last time, you got a block of rock that weighs 200,000, not 200 tons, 200,000 tons, which is 5 Queen Marys. Somebody quarried that block of rock and then moved it and set it in place. There isn't anybody in the world today that can do that. The entire Russian apparatus, the American, the Russians, the French, the British, the Europeans, the Chinese, all combined, can't pick it up and move it. Now, somebody did that past tense. Now, how'd they do that? We don't know. We ain't got a clue. And there's 57 of those stories here in the book. It's called Dead Men's Secrets. You can probably get a copy of it down at Barnes & Noble. It's fairly new. It's 2004. The author's name is Jonathan Gray. And it's put out by an outfit called, kind of an odd publisher here. I've never heard this name before. They call themselves Teach Services Incorporated. Published by Teach Services Incorporated. They got a webpage. It's www.teachservices.com. And it's TEACHS is in capitals, and ERVICES.com is in lowercase. It's the way they've got it here in the book. I'm very impressed by the book. I have heard about these stories. I have heard about batteries in the Museum of Baghdad. And I've heard of airplanes out of Ecuador, model airplanes, you know, little models of airplanes that were jets. You know, and today we would look at that and say, my God, that's a jet airplane. And made out of silver, you know, little ornaments and things like that. And you hear about these little stories, the 14-foot skeleton I told you about last time that was in the museum up in Chicago, disappeared. And this author points out that the Smithsonian is sitting on warehouses full of this stuff. And they won't put it out. They haven't destroyed it. In some cases they have. It's been destroyed. But much of it is in the warehouses. And they're not putting it out on display. It doesn't fit evolution. And if it doesn't fit evolution, then we don't put it up. And so this guy wrote a book. See how many pages are in here. It's a pretty thick book. It's like 300 pages. Come on, page numbers. Show me your stuff here. Oh, my God. Tell me there's no page numbers. Here we are, 350. Yeah, it's 350 pages or more. 350 pages, and it talks about geography, astronomy, cosmology, mathematics, metallurgy, large-scale construction, construction techniques, social organization, engineering, mechanical devices, everyday items, clothing, art, medicine, flight, space travel, ancient science and civilization, all of it documented, all of it with physical evidence that we have uncovered over the last 200, 300, 400 years. And it's sitting around in warehouses, being carefully hidden, being carefully concealed, but it's all well documented. And he's done a very professional job, footnoted it, showed you the sources. I got to tell you this story. Now, last program I told you about a 12,000-foot elevation here in the Andes Mountains, where they got this fantastic city over here with the ruins and so on, well documented by the Spanish when they got in there. They blew it up and destroyed most of it. Some of it, I mean, the site's still there. Most of the rocks are still there. They got pictures in the book here of the rocks. The tragedy of it was the destruction that was wrought by the Spanish. They just came in there and just tore it all to hell. Not exactly clear why they tore it all up. It didn't all have gold and silver in it, but much of it did, and they robbed it and stole from it. Did you know that there are pyramids in the world that are bigger than the Great Pyramid of Cheops? Now, if you're like me, you heard that the Great Pyramid of Egypt is the biggest pyramid in the world. Down in Mexico City, 40 miles out of town, there's a couple of pyramids called the Pyramid of the Sun and the Pyramid of the Moon. I saw those as a kid. I was about 20 years old or so. I went down there and I looked at those pyramids, and my God, these two pyramids look just like the pyramids over in Egypt. How could these people over here in the New World be building pyramids that look just like the pyramids in Egypt unless they had had some kind of communication? I mean, I can see people building a pyramid, on both sides of the oceans, but you got to have, if they look alike, they got to look different, if they never had any communication. If they look exactly alike, well, then obviously one saw the other and copied it. I don't know who copied what from who, but I'm pointing out that these pyramids are all over the world. It isn't just here in the New World or in the Maya lands or the Aztecs and so on, but hell, these pyramids are in China. They're in Australia. They're in the United States of America. Did you know we got 9 pyramids over here in the United States of America, sitting over in Illinois? I never read about those pyramids here in the United States when I went to school. I never heard a word about them. And one day my wife is from Illinois, and she said, have you ever heard of the pyramids in Illinois? I looked at her like, pyramids? She says, yeah, they're about the same size as the Great Pyramid of Cheops in Egypt, and there's 9 of them in Illinois. And I looked at her like, lady, you got to be out of your mind. There's no pyramids in America. If there were, I would have heard about it when I went to school. And she said, well, turn left here. Let's go take a look at one. So we drove out into the countryside, and here's this great big mountain. There are parks. The state of Illinois has a park there. I climbed to the top of one of them. The top of the pyramid, the top of this pyramid in Illinois, is 1/2 acre in size. That's the top. The top is 1/2 acre. It's bigger than your house. It's bigger than your lot for most of you people out there. I was looking on the computer last night, and we were taking a look at houses in the Los Angeles area, and there's lots, 7,000-foot lot, 8,000-foot lot, 6,000-foot lot. I mean, you people live on pieces of ground that aren't as big as the top of this pyramid. I'm not talking the bottom of the pyramid. I mean the top of it. And then, it sits on acres and acres of land, and it's 400 feet tall, and it's built out of dirt, and somebody packed all that dirt up there. I'm telling you, boys and girls, that if you had to go out here and build that pyramid today, if you called the Caterpillar Tractor Company, you'd have to have a major contracting outfit like Guy F. Atkinson to come out there and build something like that. We look at it and we say, oh, well, just a bunch of Indians with a bunch of baskets carrying dirt stacked it up there. There's no Indian tribes around here ever claimed that they built that thing. It was there when they arrived. That's what they're telling them. Well, anyway, listen to this. The tallest building in the world until this century, until the 21st century, and still the most massive structure on Earth, is an ancient pyramid 120 stories high. 120 stories. All right, now the Great Pyramid is 450 feet high. That's 450 times 10 is 4,500 feet. Is that right? No. That's I think the Great Pyramid of Cheops, if I remember, is 450 feet divided by 10. Yeah, that's 45 stories. Now remember, the Twin Towers in New York, the Twin Towers, they're 110 stories tall. Remember that? I think they were 1,100 feet, as I recall, because there's 10 feet to a story, in round numbers. So you got 110 times 10. Yeah, they're 1,100 feet tall. All right. This pyramid is sitting in China today. Today, in China. Where they find all these great things every once in a while. Well, it stands on a long, desolate, flat stretch of land 40 miles west of the ancient capital, Xianfu, on an old dirt road, caravan trail, and crosses from Peking, or Beijing they call it today, to the Mediterranean. About 2,000 feet at the base, it rises some 1,200 feet. All right, it's 2,000 feet at the base, and it rises 1,200 feet. 1,200 feet. The Great Pyramid in Egypt, 450 feet. This one rises 1,200 feet. There are actually 7 pyramids, flat-topped, with 3 carved giants resting along the outer edges. The 4 faces of the pyramids are, like so many ancient structures, aligned to the compass points. Traces of color remain on the sides, indicating that colors that were given to each side: east, aqua green; south, red; west, black; north, white; and on the flat tops, traces of yellow. A pair of American adventurers who roamed Asia between the 2 world wars, R.C. Anderson and Frank Shearer, were shown these pyramids, and Anderson visited Egypt's pyramids in 1970 and believed himself to be the only man living to have seen both the Chinese and the Egyptian pyramids. In 1946, a U.S. Army airplane crew rediscovered and photographed these pyramids from the air. Place 26 skyscrapers the size of the Empire State Building, and you have the volume of the largest Shin Si pyramid. All right, you ever hear of that? I hadn't either. So I wanted to tell you. Some skyscrapers, heights, and constructions in China equivalent to 120 stories, Ecuador 60 stories, Egypt 48, Bermuda seabed 42, Italy 35, Iraq 30, Guatemala 23, India 22, Mexico 21, Kampuchea, Kampuchea 20, Arabia 20, and Turkey 20. Now these are all buildings or monuments in China, Ecuador, Egypt, Bermuda, Italy, Iraq, Guatemala, India, Mexico, Kampuchea, wherever that is, I can't tell you. If you want to check me out, Kampuchea, probably some new country in Africa, Arabia, and Turkey, 20-story tall buildings. Hell, we weren't building 20-story buildings until 1900. And they're still here. These structures, by the way, boys and girls, have withstood time for thousands of years. And it's thought that all of these structures are built before Noah's flood and survived the flood. Or they were built right after the flood in the period of time between Noah and the Tower of Babel and up to the time of Abraham, which would have been around 2000 BC. Now, some of these monuments went through the flood, I would guess. They survived the flood. I could be wrong about that. They may have all been built on this side of the flood, every last one of them. But my guess is that some of these things, especially up in the Andes Mountains, unless, of course, they had that technology after the flood and then it was destroyed after the flood, which this guy points out could well be the case. Now, this is the section on construction, large-scale construction. There's another section in here that's called construction techniques. It's chapter 17. There's 64 examples of construction techniques. He starts off by saying, it is a human impossibility, gasped Hyatt Verrill. And he's right, and yet it happened. The great mountains of the Peruvian Andes are awesome enough until you gaze up those extremely steep slopes, and you perceive the death-defying ruins perched on top of these mountaintops. The setting is terrifyingly wild, mountains miles high, vanishing into the sky, notched with narrow ledges, slashed with ravines and bottomless gorges. Waterfalls of an awesome beauty plunge from these immaculate snowy peaks down into the damp, unknown depths of the canyons. So rare is the air that even the mules are obliged to stop every 10 paces to catch their breath. Here at the frontiers of the impossible, a vanished civilization set gems in stone, astonishing and astoundingly assembled polygonal walls suspended over the abyss. They carved practically vertical stairways up stupendous precipices. High in the clouds rises one acrobatic stairway of 64 steps, which had to be carved in a place where one could only get a toehold for support. Another comprises 600 steps. Just imagine that. And then here are the pictures of these stairways up these mountains. Now, these ingenious jewels, or jewelers in rock, ascended a dizzying mountain no wider than the blade of a sword, and topped it with watchtowers and walls pierced with lookouts. The mountain drops away so abruptly that if a workman slipped, his body would not hit the bottom for 3,000 feet. Today, on all sides, the ruins of temples, fortresses, and towers surmount the peaks and cling to the vertical sides of the canyons like ivy. Overlooking a waterfall, a splendid palace rises above the fierce abyss, impossible to reach. How was this palace built? Terraces were miraculously inlaid into vertical slopes, perched over the canyon faults. How did they hoist up heavy, carved rocks by the thousands? Site after site is built atop bluffs, which are too steep to be accessible. Many seem to have been literally hurled up as though the monstrous stones flew there. A high carved niche opens out over the abyss, under a ridge shaped like the letter I. The rock was leveled and encrusted with carefully joined stone cubes. Only a daring mountaineer hanging from a rope could possibly reach it. The builder magicians, I tell you, had no sense of the impossible. Everywhere loom buildings that defy the laws of equilibrium and gravity, as well as vertigo. These are a triumph of human daring and of technology which almost smacks of science fiction. And would you believe it? Sometimes the enormous blocks were brought from quarries more than 1,000 miles away. Now, boys and girls, let me point this out. You got rock. Now, these aren't the super big rocks. These are rocks, of 10, be 3, 6, 9, 10 tons. Little rocks, about the size of the rocks that went into the Great Pyramid, the blocks of rock. But they're raised up on mountains, steep mountains, that are up around 10 to 12,000 feet in the Andes Mountains, where the air is so thin that the mules have to stop about every 10 paces to catch their breath. Now, how the hell do you build stuff like that up there in those mountains? It isn't being built by muscle labor. It's being built by some kind of machines and mechanical labor. Now, many are covered with intricate carvings. No man alive could duplicate such carvings with the stone tools that we find. As Hyatt Verrell remarks, it is not a question of skill, patience, and time. It is a human impossibility. We're just taking a look at it, boys and girls. It's there. Like it or lump it. There's the pictures of it here in the book. And I've seen this, time and time again. It was the Incas and the Aztecs, that built some of these monuments years ago. How'd they do that? Where'd they get that kind of technology? And the thing here that is so ingenious in this book are that these kinds of monuments have been found all over the world, and the genius that this guy, Jonathan Gray, has put together here is that he's rounded up not one or two odd ones like you and I have heard about, reading about it in Reader's Digest, or some odd story. He put it all together. Antarctica. There are traditions of a legendary rainbow city where the colors of the rainbow are said to have been used in the construction of the buildings and even in the paving of the streets. In Rome, glass-storied theater. Emilio Scararo, S-C-A-U-R-O, Scararo, one of Sulla's generals, had a 3-floored theater built at Rome for 80,000 spectators. The first floor of marble, the second floor of glass, the third of gilded wood. Boys and girls, 80,000 spectators. The big stadiums of baseball and football today hold 50. The big stadiums. Is there an 80,000-seat stadium here in the United States of America? If there is, send me an email and let me know where it's at. Would you? I don't think there are any 80,000-seat stadiums anywhere in the world today. I haven't heard of any. This guy in Rome built an 80,000-seat stadium. Worldwide, the use of concrete, the standard mixture of sand and cement that makes up most building blocks of today, was evidently worldwide. Listen to this. They found it at Yaxuna, Tucoba, Mexico, Cuauhcillo, Mexico, Guatemala, Quito, Ecuador, Cunza, Ecuador, Marchusni, Peru, Santa Cruz, Bolivia, Pompeii, Italy, Tourette-sur-Loup, France, Cohard, France, Crete, Sterveco, Yugoslavia, Egypt, Northwest China, Western Australia, Arkansas in the USA, Tennessee in the USA, and New Mexico in the USA are all sites where we have found ancient monuments or buildings made with cement that we didn't discover and use here in the modern world until the last 2 centuries. Well, obviously the concrete technology was available all over the world, for crying out loud, thousands of years ago. Well, how come we didn't have concrete over the last 1,000 years if it was available to those people 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years ago? Boys and girls, they had technology years ago. And then we lost sight of it. We went into what we call the Dark Ages. And then Julius Caesar went into Alexandria and destroyed 1 million volumes in the Alexandria Library. And the Romans, have been called the great builders, the great civilization. The Romans were the great destroyers. The Romans destroyed more than they ever built. Civilization and technology was so much greater than when the Romans were here as to defy description. The Romans never discovered anything. They destroyed what they found. And that's one more example. Let's take a look at another one. The seabed off Bimini, but now raised into a jetty material at Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Perfectly drilled 5-pointed star holes with sharply defined tips cut right through 12-foot-long blocks of granite. Other huge 1/2 to 6-inch diameter round holes perfectly drilled through 12-foot thick blocks of rock. Granite, one of the most abrasive stones, wears expensive diamond drill bits down to nothing very quickly. Okay, kids. And they took it off the seabed off Bimini. It's now sitting in the jetty material at Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Perfectly drilled, 5-pointed star holes with sharply defined tips, cut right through 12-foot-long blocks of granite. Another huge 1/2 to 6-inch diameter round holes, perfectly drilled through 12-foot thick blocks. Hey, kids, we ain't had that technology over the past 100 years. Where'd those people get it thousands of years ago? 200 years, 500 years, 1,000, 2,000 years ago. Where'd it come from? Did it come from savages evolving from monkeys, dragging their hands or knuckles on the ground? Come on, kids, let's grow up and get real. You know, the people over in Borneo who are still living back in the Stone Age are not doing that kind of technology. And you're sitting there saying, well, you know, we men, we're getting smarter and smarter as time goes along. Hell, we can't do that today. Over in Turkey, the boring of holes finer than the thinnest needle in a block of hard stone. Turkey. Over in Turkey. They got holes bored through stone which is finer than the thinnest needle. We can't do that today. Boring into granite rock with drills that turned 500 times faster than modern power drills today. 500 times faster. In Peru, Tibet, Egypt, and the Sudan, outer walls sheeted in gold, silver, polished marble, or sparkling white gypsum. Granite building blocks, smoothly polished like glass. Practically all buildings of antiquity have been stripped of their outer shiny surfaces, so that today we see only the raw stonework. In Syria, Babylon, Mexico, Samaria, plaster-coated surfaces. In Tibet and Babylon, decorated enamel or blue porcelain walls. Enamel, blue porcelain, Tibet and Babylon, today. China, Babylon, Mexico, and Egypt, multicolor surfaces on building exteriors. In Brazil, the use of different colored stones in the approach steps to buildings. Peru, steps polished like glass. Bolivia, colored decorated pillars. Greece and Peru, hydraulic gates opened by means of a complicated jet of water. In Crete, Etruscans in Italy, hydraulic lifts. Essential to the support of highly technological society must have been the use of massive water storage dams of modern strength. The enigma was, vestiges of these appeared not to exist. As I sought for evidence, the question kept emerging. Had river rampages obliterated all traces? Recently, one solution to this mystery fell open in quite a bizarre manner. Arkansas. Carpet rock, an area, an acre or so in size, which recently split off the Petite Jean mountainside, has a curved grid of ironwork running all through it that gives it the carpet appearance. Examination, however, shows it to be reinforced concrete with the steel gridwork still intact and little rusted, surprisingly, until you realize that it was sealed from oxidation until splitting off the cliff only recently. The whole cliff, carpet rock, and Petite Jean is thus seen to be one vast concrete pour, very, very old. It was the spillway of a vast dam which must have contained the White River and the Arkansas River in one great impounded lake. Now, does this sound like the work of semi-primitive men who had to use stone tools, horses, and vine ropes? No, the early builders obviously had sophisticated techniques. In later times, methods became more basic and building less ambitious. The earlier apparatus fell into disuse, gradually disintegrated, and was ultimately lost to history. That's here in Arkansas. Carpet rock. Features of houses, 2- and 3-story dwellings. In Lebanon, Crete, Tunisia, Arizona, houses of 5 and 6 stories. Pakistan, Babylonia, expert construction in bricks similar to our own, heated to about 900 degrees. So they weren't just making mud bricks, boys and girls, they were making fired bricks.
All right, we've been taking a look at construction techniques in large-scale construction. I'm an old-timey contractor. That caught my eye right away. I see these buildings, monuments. I see concrete being used, cement being used in ancient structures. I see pyramids in China. I see pyramids in Mexico. I see pyramids in Illinois. There are pyramids all over the world. Pyramids, like the pyramids of Egypt, all over the world. Who built them and why? I suspect many of those were built before the flood. And if not, then the technology from before the flood, assuming that it was all destroyed, then was built after the flood, in that period of time between about, 2350 BC and about, maybe, 1500 BC, maybe a 1,000-year period. Now, there's a lot of questions that you probably have in your mind that are answered in other chapters in the book. Always keep in mind that when I review a book, I cannot read the whole thing to you. I can't cover every page, every subject, every topic, every chapter. So I pick out of the book those chapters that are really boggle the mind. Now, there's one in here that deals with electricity. Have I got electric in here? Where is it? Geography, astronomy, cosmology, mathematics, metallurgy, large-scale construction, construction techniques, engineering, mechanical devices, everyday items. There's a chapter in here that deals with electricity, and I can't put my finger on it. So I'm not going to spend the time looking for it right now. How about microscopes? Microscope. Did Moses have a microscope? Now, we know that Galileo discovered the telescope, sometime in the 1500s. And then from that, somebody got smart and they said, well, if we can see out to the moon, can we see something a little bit smaller? And then we polished glass. And then we made the glass convex and concave. And as time progressed, we finally came up with microscopes. Well, listen to this story. It's chapter 15. Glasswork. Microscope on a sexy spider. Leaping lizards. What do you make of that? Shall we bank for another run? The Peruvian flyers could scarcely believe their eyes. Spread out below all over the desolate Nazca Plateau was a mass of geometric patterns and giant pictures of birds, animals, and people as far as the eye could see. These ground-drawn objects were so numerous that they could be seen only from an airplane. Small wonder that they were not discovered until that day in 1939. Now, here are some really fabled, and you've probably heard this what do they call this thing now? Nazca, N-A-Z-C-A. I imagine if you put that into a Google search, you probably get a lot of information, Nazca. Anyway, for those of you that are uninitiated, down here in Peru, up around 15,000 feet, there's a flat plateau. And on this plateau is a spider. This spider is 6 miles across. It's built about 18 inches high out of just little rocks. Somebody went out here, and they just picked up little rocks, and they built a stone wall 18 inches high. And they built it in the outline of a spider. And the thing is 6 miles across. 6 miles. And it's in perfect size. I mean, the legs are the perfect size with the head, and the head's perfect sized with the body. And it's got all 8 legs, and they all stick out in one thing. There's monkeys and other animals, and there's people, and they're 6-8 miles across. The only way you can see, when you're on the ground and you're walking along, what you see is a stone wall. And so you walk along and you say, gee, here's a little stone wall, 18 inches. It won't keep a sheep in. It won't keep a llama in. It won't keep a cow in. And it's about 18 inches high, and it's uniform in height, and it goes out there for a long, long ways. I mean, you can look down this wall, and it curves, but you can't see what it is. You could not tell that was a spider by looking at this walking on the ground. But in 1939, some guy's flying over it with an airplane taking pictures, and he says, oh, my God, there's a great big spider down there, and it's 6 miles across. Well, then they went down there, and they started measuring this thing. Who built that? And who built the monkey? And who built the people, the outlines of these people in these 18-inch stone walls? That's who built it. And then the question is, why? Why would anybody do such a thing? Because you couldn't appreciate it. You couldn't even know it was there unless you were in an airplane flying over it. You have to be in an airplane. You got to be up in the air over the top of it to see what the hell it is. That's how big it is. Now, that tells you pretty plainly that whoever built that thing built that to be looked at, and the people that are going to look at it are going to look at it from an airplane or from up in the air. Could be a gas balloon, But then if that's the case, then gas balloons were invented before 1700. First one I heard of was a hot air balloon flown in France about, 1705 or something like that. But it gets better than that. Not only do we need an airplane to see this, fashioned by an unknown pre-Inca culture and covering an area of 30 square miles, they're still unexplained. So here's 30 square miles of plateau with a number of these monuments, these monkeys, spiders, and people laid out on the ground in 18-inch high little rock walls. We have no idea, working from the ground, anybody could execute such figures in perfect proportion. They can be observed successfully only from 1,000 feet in the air. One of the drawings depicts a spider. It has one leg deliberately lengthened and extended, and at the tip of the leg there is a small cleared area. Now, there's only one spider known who uses the tip of its third leg in this precise manner shown in the drawing in this 6-mile-long rock wall spider. It's called the Riccinuli. It's spelled R-I-C-I-N-U-L-E-I. Riccinuli. That's the way I'm pronouncing it. It inhabits caves deep in the Amazon jungle. This spider is recognized by scientists for its unique method of copulation, for which it uses that extended leg in the described manner that's in this spider at Nazca Plateau in Peru. It is an extremely rare species of spider. Now, for the incredible part. This spider's mode of reproduction can be only observed by the aid of a microscope. Boys and girls, let's stop and think about this for a minute. Up here on top of this plateau is this huge spider, 6 miles across. You can't even see that this is a spider unless you're up in an airplane at least 1,000 feet in the air. So you can look down on it and see 6 miles across. This spider is in perfect proportion. It's built out of rock. It's not big rocks now, just little ordinary rocks. You can just pick them up and stack them in a rock wall. And the spider now, from the tip of one side of it to the tip of the other side, is 6 miles across. And then from the other side to the other side, it's about 4 miles across. It's wider than it is, it's longer than it is wide. So it's 4 by 6 miles. You've got to be in an airplane to see it. The third leg is extended in a way that only this rare spider extends its leg. This leg is used in copulation, in reproduction. And the only way that you can see the way this spider reproduces with this leg is with a microscope. What's that tell you? It tells you that the guy that built the spider up there had to have a microscope to observe the spider so that he would know that the spider reproduces with this third leg. Then when it's reproduced, it's done by a spider being built in stone walls in perfect proportions, 4 by 6 miles. Now, boys and girls, that's quite a story. So the question is, how were these artists able to find and then observe their tiny model unless we concede that they inherited a knowledge of science equaling our own, including the use of the ground optical lens in a microscope? Turning therefore to glasswork, we find ourselves treated to more surprises from the ancient world. And yet nothing is incredible any longer. The word impossible should have become literally impossible for us. China, before 2500 BC, Assyria, 2700 BC, and Medzamer, Armenia, 2500 BC, the making of glass was well known. In Haifa, Israel, a glass block weighing 88 tons. There are only 2 masses of glass that are larger than this 88 tons, and both are the casts for the huge mirrors of the Mount Palomar telescopes. Got this? Ancient times, 88-ton piece of glass. It's sitting in Haifa, Israel. Now, we're told, of course, that ancient man was backward, I hope my curiosity will be pardoned. I have a question. How did those early races develop the enormous amount of heat necessary to melt the ingredients into this enormous mass of glass? Well, obviously, this block is inexplicable, except with reference to a super technology. Now, I want to point out that when you got a piece of glass 88 tons in size, boys and girls, those Mount Palomar telescopes, that telescope, that 200-incher up there, it's bigger. It weighs more than that 88 tons. Now go back, do a Google search on Mount Palomar. They built the thing back in the 1930s. And when you read the story of how that Palomar telescope was built, it'll just boggle your mind. And here is a story back in ancient times. They got a block of rock that they call glass. It's 88 tons in size. Huh? Boy, you got to have real technology. That Palomar telescope was designed and built by the Corning Glass Works in New York. They were the only people in the world that could cast a piece of glass that big, and that was back in the 1930s. Then the thing had to be shipped on railroad cars, special railroad cars out to California. Then they had to move it from the railroad cars in Los Angeles up to the top of this mountain. I mean, it's a story that just boggles your mind. It was a hell of a feat back in the 1930s. And here we got the same thing going on thousands of years ago. But they didn't have railroads, and they didn't have trucks, they didn't have gas engines, they didn't have furnaces. Way back there, they were dragging their knuckles on the ground, hitting their old lady over the head and dragging her off by the hair. That's what we're told in school. Come on. What we're dealing with here in modern times is a fairy tale, like the Land of Oz for adults. Evolution is a fairy tale for adults, and they tell us long, long ago and far, far away. What a bunch of horse pucky. Now, the book again is called Dead Men's Secrets. The author is Jonathan Gray. I'm not sure you'll find this book in a used bookstore. It's pretty new. It's published in 2004. I think if you went to Barnes & Noble, they'd probably get you a copy of it. Dead Men's Secrets. I don't know where this came from. I've got books stacked up here in my office that are here for review. I probably have 30 stacked up here now. I picked this book up the other day. I couldn't set it down. I never saw anything like it. Now, I've heard these stories. I've heard of that Nazca Plateau. I probably read about it in Discover Magazine or maybe Reader's Digest, or something like that. And then, you read these odd stories, and then you say, God, that's really amazing. And then, you don't hear any more about it. Over a course of a lifetime, you probably can think of 10 or 15 of those. This guy, Gray, has them in here by the hundreds. There's one section in here that has 103 examples. On construction, there's chapter 15 and 16. One of them's 57. And the other one is something else. I've forgotten exactly. Yeah, here it is. There's 57 examples of skyscraper height, huge constructions, and etc. And then there's 64 examples of construction techniques that are modern. Techniques like concrete that I told you about. Now, I can't sit here and read them all to you because I want to cover a broader spectrum than that. But listen, there's 18 areas of life and technology. Like sailing around the world. Columbus discovered America back in 1492, and we say, hey, he was the first guy to get over here. I've mentioned this in the past. That's poppycock. Poppycock. When Columbus got here, there were people here, for crying out loud. To say Columbus discovered America is nonsense. When he got here, the continent was people. There were people everywhere. So obviously those people got over here somehow. So the archaeologists come along and say, well, yeah, they did, see, but there was this land bridge between Siberia and Alaska. And they came across that land bridge.
That time in history now. We're in the days of Noah, and everything that preceded Noah building the ark and the judgment of Almighty God on this earth that was in rebellion is about to be relived.
like to stress is the fact that we are now entering those days once again.
a good distance, 1,000, 2,000 years after the flood, he's writing this. And he says the Nephilim, the unholy progeny of the fallen angels and the women of earth, creating this hybrid being known as the Nephilim, were on the earth in those days and also afterward. In other words, and there's a lot of confusion about this. There's only one incursion. Nonsense. There are many incursions, multiple incursions.
And in fact, when Joshua came into the promised land,
who's there?
He had to fight, let's face it, non-human beings. They're called giants in the Bible. In Hebrew, they have many names. But my point, and here's the point, folks, that I want to make as we begin to talk about Watchers 8, because it opens on a note that you might find unbelievable. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. But I have to say that before the flood, the supernatural descended and touched the natural world. Jude talks about this.
Sure.
Peter talks about it. Good old Apostle Peter mentions this, the fact that the angels left their first estate. There are a lot of people who argue against this, saying, you know, these were the sons of Seth and so forth. But for the sake of our today's program, what L.A. and I would
North American accounts of the giant skeletons that were found in the Ohio and Pennsylvania Valley. I'm talking everything from 10 to 12 foot tall guys found in copper armor. And the more I investigated, I found out it was a worldwide.
The Watchers, the first set, God referred to them as the children of heaven. How many knew that? They were the children. They were young. One of the same angels that made a pact on Mount Hermon was also the serpent in the garden. How many know that? How many know that? He was in the Garden of Eden. He is a serpent. That did his thing. Semyaza was deceived by Lucifer himself, which, by the way, his kind is of a serpent. Just so you don't think I'm going off the rocker, you're also going to have to know about Michael, Uriel, Raphael, Gabriel, Ramiel, Sarah-Kehal, and Raguel. You have to know about those angels. You're going to have to know who the 4 angels are that stand before God and what their jobs are. By the way, it's your heritage. You need to know what their jobs are, right? It's your heritage. You do realize they're fellow servants. The angels are. They're your fellow servants. How many know that the angels are your fellow servants? The only thing missing is the true archetypes of who they are. Because mankind once deified them. They once deified them, not understanding their jobs. And then when Jesus Christ came, He placed some of their responsibilities in you through the Holy Spirit. How many know that? How many know that? You know what? You might be really thankful for Jesus Christ after this conversation. Salvation is one thing, but to be able to survive and walk and stand in this world, that's another thing.
Giants walk among us still, hidden in tattered robes. They speak quiet mostly, though their presence always known. They fall like thunder, wither and die, struggle incessantly, reaching the sky. We try to box them, they cannot fit in. The giants corrupt what we try to keep hidden. And if one day we make it inside, find a way to conquer the giant's hide, we'll watch the giants that we
of fallen angels and the bastard children called Nephilim. God destroyed the Nephilim's bodies and doomed them to wander the earth in an invisible dimension, and they are still terrifying men. In our modern paradigm, they are known as demon spirits. The word demon is from the Greek language and means knowledge. The demon knowledge is greater than man's. The Bible tells of their creation in Genesis chapter 6, and they were the cause of the destruction of life on earth. The Apocrypha and early Jewish writings expound on these evil spirits. The book of Enoch tells of their giant stature and how they manipulated the genetics of man and animals, in every imaginable way. In other words, no stone was left unturned, in their evil experiments.
These evil spirits who proceeded from the giants that are still roaming the earth, and they will do so until the days of consummation. Here's what they do. They attack. They afflict, they oppress, they destroy, they do battle, they work destruction on the earth, they cause offenses. And again, these spirits proceeded from the giants, who came from people and part spirit, and so their number one target are people. Number one target. Folks, some of this can get weird, but it will explain. You guys have knowledge of the great monoliths and so forth in the world. These great structures, the pyramids and everything else. I'm going to bust a few bubbles tonight. Because everybody's starting to go down this wrong path concerning all the constructions of old. And it's not right. Actually, it's quite simple. It's not complicated. It's not a miracle. It's something that was done. And you have to know the architecture of the spiritual realm to understand what I'm talking about. That's like portals. People talk about portals all day. The average person will say, well, what's a portal for? Isn't that from the Wizard of Oz or something? right? But let me explain something to you. These evil spirits don't need a portal. They've been here since the beginning. I'll share something with you. Just to show you what people may not know, but it's knowledge and wisdom that was given out a long time ago that people don't really accept now. Now understand this. God gives His wisdom to anyone who will receive it. The problem is no one wants to receive His wisdom because they already think they have enough. Okay? They already think they have enough. I've heard a great many stories about the children of heaven who are called